Segment 8A, Introduction. The turning point in the history of the Roman Republic was their second war against the Carthaginian Empire. This so-called Second Punic War, or even Hannibalic War, lasted from 218 to 201 BC. Rome entered this war as one of several Mediterranean powers, but emerged from this war as the superpower in the Mediterranean. There was a great deal of suffering, bloodshed, and excruciating uncertainty in between, which can be summed up in the phrase Hannibal ad portas, which means Hannibal is at the door, as indeed he was. For centuries, Roman parents would say this to scare the togas off of their little children. But there was a time when all Rome shook at the mention of Hannibal. Rome spent years on the ropes. In outlasting Hannibal, and then by defeating Hannibal, Rome was able to embark upon, apparently, its true destiny. I must warn you that this lecture has oodles of historical content. In segment 8B, Evil Empires, we learn why Carthage became the Romans' greatest example of an evil empire. Every superpower has an especially hated enemy it can use to rile its people up to superhuman efforts. For years and years and years, we had the Soviet Union. For years before that, we had the evil Nazi Germans and evil Japanese, and so on. For the Romans, the Carthaginians certainly earned their evil empire status. Even so, the Romans and Carthaginians had actually, prior to their wars, experienced 2.5 centuries of peaceful and profitable relations. The Romans won their first go-around over the island of Sicily in a war that took from 264 BC to 241 BC. But to do so, they had to create their very first navy, and they had to invent, by chance, a brilliant new naval technology. Even so, the Carthaginians just got knocked down. They would get up again. Segment 8C, Hannibal ad portas, describes the great gut check of Roman history called the Second Punic War. Both the Romans and the Carthaginians knew there would be a second round. After years of tense waiting, Hannibal utterly shocked the Romans by coming in over the Alps to invade Italy in 218 BC. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, 2 Roman consular armies were ripped to shreds. And Rome discovered there was only one safe thing to do when Hannibal was in the country: run. Yet Hannibal could not muster the men and resources necessary to beat the Romans either. A bold Roman invasion of Carthage forced Hannibal to go back to Africa. Close as Rome had come to total defeat, her victory, too, was nearly total. We will see in segment 8D, Rome becomes a superpower, how Rome coped with both the positive and negative consequences of victory over Carthage. Because Rome was now the old alpha dog in the Mediterranean, she was also the #1 target of the other powers. And again, to quote Wilt Chamberlain, nobody roots for Goliath. She especially worried the large empires of the East, which had once been part of Alexander's empire. The Roman Senate and people alike wanted to ensure that there would be no more Hannibals. This, in turn, caused Rome to make preemptive wars upon eastern cities and states, hitting the eastern powers before they had a chance to hit Rome. And they even hit some cities and states which posed no threat whatsoever. Segment 8B, Evil Empires. As long as there have been superpowers, there have also been evil empires. The American term evil empire comes from the 1977 classic Star Wars, in which the plucky rebels saved the universe from the tyrannical galactic empire and its evil minions. Even though the bad guys of the galactic empire speak with British accents, the concept is basically warmed over Cold War. The plot of Star Wars intentionally recalls plucky Americans trying to save the world from the tyrannical Soviet Union and its minions. The plot, however, is in fact very ancient, with only the names changed. The ancient Greeks had the Persians, whom they demonized as cruel, stupid barbarians. And the ancient Romans had the Carthaginians. Even though Rome soundly defeated Carthage in the Second Punic War, which ended in 201 BC, and even though Rome provoked a Third Punic War, ending with the obliteration of Carthage in 146 BC, little Roman kids were terrified for centuries afterwards by the single phrase, Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the doors. Over the years, it became just a saying about a boogeyman who would show up at a Roman kid's door with his elephants. But in Hannibal's own day, Hannibal ad portas stood for the Romans' genuine terror that their nation was on the ropes, as indeed it was. The seaport of Carthage was founded in 814 BC. It was one of several Phoenician trading colonies founded in the western Mediterranean. In fact, the name Carthago basically means new city in Phoenician. Today, we know this ancient empire as Carthage, and its people as the Carthaginians. But the Roman word for Phoenicians is Poini, leading to the terms Punic Wars for Rome's wars against Carthage. As long as Rome's and Carthage's interests didn't clash, they were actually quite friendly. In 509 BC, Carthage signed a treaty with the infant Roman Republic, pledging peace and commercial cooperation. The treaty was renewed in 306 BC and 278 BC, when Carthage and Rome agreed not to deal independently with King Pyrrhus. Because Carthage's strategic location let it dominate all trade passing below the southern tip of Italy, Carthage developed a mighty navy, which enabled it to develop troops, usually mercenaries, to any point in the western Mediterranean. They wanted to own the ships and hire the soldiers. With time, Carthage gained control over much of the North African coastline, along with Corsica and Sardinia, and began to fight with Greek cities for influence in Sicily. By 310 BC, all of Sicily, just about, was part of the Carthaginian Empire. As mentioned earlier, Rome's victory in the Pyrrhic Wars had given her control over the Italian peninsula by 272 BC. This fact made Rome a Mediterranean power by default, equal to the quote-unquote successor states of Alexander the Great to the east, and to the west, the Carthaginian Empire. In fact, Rome and Carthage are surprisingly close together for two such famous enemies. They are on different continents, but they are separated only by two narrow straits and the island of Sicily. Remember that the United States has always been fixated on the island of Cuba, and not without reason. Cuba is only 90 miles away from the mainland United States, and any power with a base on Cuba would present a clear and present danger. Sicily had long since been settled by Greek and Phoenician colonists, and was packed with city-states of its own, many of which were older and more established than Rome. Carthage already controlled the western half of Sicily and thought of the rest of the island being in their sphere of influence. When the Mamertines, a group of Italian mercenaries living in Messina, on the northern tip of Sicily, revolted against Carthage in 264 BC, Carthage struck back hard. At this point, the Mamertine mercenaries appealed to Rome for help. The Romans were not obligated to comply. After all, Rome and Carthage had always been friends. The Romans didn't care about a bunch of Italian mercenaries who were happy to take Carthaginian money and then got mad at Carthage. But the idea of a Carthaginian naval base just off the tip of Italy scared them to death. Therefore, the Senate recommended that Rome support the Mamertines against the Carthaginians. This met the dictates of the Ius Fetialis. That is to say, it meant that the Carthaginians started it, and it touched off what we call the First Punic War. The technology itself of the First Punic War between Rome and Carthage, which lasted from 264 to 241 BC, is pretty interesting. Since the Sicilian mountains are no place to fight a land war, most of the war took place at sea. There was one problem for the Romans because they were complete and total landlubbers. The odds would seem stacked in favor of the seafaring Carthaginians. But typically, Roman is the fact that they figured out a strategy for taking the land war on sea. Instead of ramming the Carthaginian ships, which was standard practice at the time, the Romans developed a gangplank with a big hook in the end, which they called a corvus, or crow. Once the Roman ship dropped its gangplank onto the Carthaginian ship, the corvus held the gangplank in place, so the Roman marines could run on board the Carthaginian ship and kill the Carthaginian sailors. This innovation, the corvus, turned a Roman weakness into a Roman advantage. As long as the Roman fleet could make it into battle without sinking, that was sometimes difficult, it could win. Eventually, this boiled down to a war of material attrition. The Carthaginians blinked first. The richer Carthaginians were tired of a costly war and tired of paying for a fleet, so they started withholding money. The Romans, on the other hand, and especially the wealthiest Romans, proved more than willing to keep spending money on the navy. Finally, in 241 BC, the Romans destroyed the Carthaginian fleet and made Carthage sue for peace. The prize was basically complete Roman control over Sicily. That is how Rome wound up with a navy and with its very first province of Sicily. By 237 BC, Rome had taken the islands of Sardinia and Corsica away from Carthage. These two islands became Rome's second province. By acquiring territories off of mainland Italy, Rome took its first steps towards Mediterranean empire. Carthage was defeated, all right, but far from broken. Both sides in the First Punic War knew that it was all but inevitable that there would be a second go-around. Segment 8C, Hannibal ad Portas. The western Mediterranean was not big enough for Carthage and Rome. Though the First Punic War was ended by treaty in 241 BC, both sides knew future hostilities were inevitable. The Romans kept chipping away at the Carthaginian Empire. Soon, Sardinia and Corsica became a new Roman province joining Sicily. Rome's new acquisitions provided a massive boost to the Roman economy. Carthage, on the other hand, had to rebuild its economy without the wealth of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. A new source of income was crucial, and Spain presented a great window of opportunity. Under the general Hamilcar Barca, Carthage very quickly conquered almost all of southern and eastern Spain. In fact, Spain's mineral resources made Carthage even wealthier than it had been prior to the First Punic War. Now it was the Romans' turn to be very concerned. The Carthaginian war party, led by Hamilcar and his young son Hannibal, made no secret of their determination to get even with Rome for the First Punic War. Meanwhile, Rome had already pushed its northern boundaries to the foot of the Alps and was looking over the Alps into southern Gaul, modern-day France. This would be a potential second point of conflict with Carthage. The last thing Rome needed was a rebuilt Carthaginian army roaring all over the western Mediterranean. So when the small Spanish town of Saguntum asked Rome for a treaty promising help against the Carthaginians, in 221, the Romans were happy to oblige. The Romans knew that Carthage would eventually attack Saguntum, and that they would have to defend Saguntum, and that a second Punic War would result. Again, the jus fetialis or official law would be satisfied because the Carthaginians would have started the war, which meant in turn that the Romans would win. The Romans had no idea what they were in for. In 218 BC, Hannibal's forces took Saguntum. The Romans demanded that the Carthaginians withdraw from the city and that they send Hannibal to Rome to be punished. Carthage would not give Saguntum back. But Hannibal did indeed obediently head for Rome with a little bit of company, his army. In September 218, Hannibal and his army crossed the Alps into northern Italy. The series of smashing victories which followed won thousands of Gauls to Hannibal's side. Encouraged by his diplomatic success, Hannibal won over other dissatisfied Roman allies and subject peoples. Proof that the Romans still had a lot to learn about running an empire. The desperate Romans elected Quintus Fabius Maximus for dictator for 6 months in 217 BC. But Fabius considered himself too weak to do anything but track Hannibal, earning himself the title Cunctator, or delayer. The elected consuls of 216 BC were ashamed. They took a more aggressive tack. They led a force of 80,000 Romans against Hannibal at Cannae. And Hannibal destroyed this army in what was Rome's single greatest defeat of all time. Suddenly, Fabius's delaying tactics looked a lot more sensible. As Hannibal worked his way south into Italy, even more Roman allies rushed to his side, as did the Samnites and much of Sicily. Hannibal was literally at the doors of Rome, but he did not have the manpower and he did not have the logistical support to finish the Romans off. Yet the Romans also, strangely, lacked the strength and the willpower to kick Hannibal out of Italy for good. Hannibal raided, the Romans retreated. Hannibal plundered, the Romans regrouped, and so on. The defections of Roman allies died out when it became clear that neither Rome nor Carthage was actually winning. This was, I suppose, a minor victory for Rome, but not really a solution. To complicate matters, one of the Eastern Mediterranean powers jumped on Rome while Rome was down. Philip V of Macedon, who controlled most of mainland Greece, allied himself with Carthage and began hostilities with Rome in 215 BC. So the Romans found themselves fighting a three-front war. A stalemate with Hannibal in central Italy, a seesaw battle with Spain in the west, and a holding action against Philip of Macedon in the east. Carthage, for its part, considered Spain and its mineral wealth more crucial to the war than Hannibal's Italian invasion force. By and by, Carthage diverted resources to their Spanish troops, which were led by Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal. After managing to trounce a Roman army in 211 BC, Hasdrubal thought he would cross the Alps and join his big brother. And this was a bad career move. Hasdrubal's decision basically abandoned Spain to the Romans, who conquered most of the peninsula under the brilliant young general Publius Cornelius Scipio. We'll hear more about this guy. Even worse for Carthage, Hasdrubal was intercepted and killed by Roman troops in 207. It meant that all Hannibal could do was retreat to the mountains and make the Romans force him out. This could have taken forever, thanks to the delaying tactics invented by Fabius. But in 205 BC, young Publius Cornelius Scipio was elected consul on a platform of taking the battle to Africa, thereby forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal. Scipio's election as consul violated the mos maiorum. Scipio was a member of a very old and very famous patrician family, but as a mere lad of 31, he was 12 years too young to hold the consulship. The more conservative senators, such as Fabius Maximus, opposed the invasion of Africa and tried to force Scipio to keep his army in Sicily. To enhance their performance against Hannibal, the Romans at this time brought in the cult of Magna Mater, the Great Mother, from Asia Minor, with some genuinely zany circumstances I'll discuss later. But Scipio was not one to listen to stodgy old men or superstitious priests. Scipio invaded Africa, and as predicted, Hannibal abandoned Italy to defend the Carthaginian homeland. After the Battle of Zama, just outside Carthage, in 203 BC, Hannibal himself realized the game was up, and he convinced Carthage to sue for peace. The more conservative Roman aristocracy, like Fabius Maximus, wanted Carthage to be punished or even razed to the ground. Given the nastiness of the Second Punic War, it's hard to blame them. But according to the mos maiorum, the final decision belonged to the victorious general. Scipio rewarded Hannibal for his good sense and good faith by appointing Hannibal the civic leader of Carthage. The Roman aristocracy was not pleased. The Roman masses, on the other hand, happily welcomed Scipio back to Rome, and they pleaded with him to take control of the state. But with typical Roman modesty, typical Roman regard for the mos maiorum, Scipio settled for the honorific title Africanus, becoming Scipio of Africa. He then spent the rest of his career in comparative quiet. Segment 8D, Rome becomes a superpower. Rome's victory over Carthage in the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, was final. Combined with Rome's victory over King Philip V of Macedon, it made Rome the major power in the Mediterranean world. The Romans were now the masters of locations such as Sicily, Corsica, Illyria, and Transpadane Gaul. Yet the Roman aristocracy's passiveness in fighting Hannibal suggests that Rome had no clear-cut imperialist agenda. The Romans never did forget how close Hannibal had come to beating them. The cry Hannibal ad portas sent little Roman kids skittering for centuries afterward. But as the superpower in the Mediterranean, the Romans were now obliged to maintain order in the territory they now ruled. Rome needed a workable public plan for ensuring it would never again come so close to defeat. Up until the Second Punic War, most of Rome's wars had in fact been defensive. Since this satisfied the jus fetialis, the Romans found this a comfortable way to operate. But Rome's new superpower responsibilities brought on a period of aggressive imperialism, in which the Romans picked fights in order to stabilize the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean world. We've already seen that Rome had no coherent plan for assimilating its Italian conquests and Italian allies. Some towns got citizenship, some towns got Latin rights, and some towns got the shaft. The Mos Maiorum had no provisions for assigning ager publicus, that is to say, captured land belonging to the Roman state. But the experience of the Second Punic War proved to the Romans that a workable plan was desperately needed. So the Romans invented a system of provinces. The provinces of Sicily, 241 BC, Sardinia and Corsica, 231 BC, nearer Spain, 197 BC, farther Spain, 197 BC, and Illyricum, 167 BC, were established and overseen by pro-magistrates. Pro-magistrates were former consuls or former praetors who served a year governing one of these provinces. The Roman provinces were ruled for Rome's benefit alone. The proconsuls and propraetors themselves were accountable only to the Roman Senate, of which they were already influential members. In his own province, the proconsul or propraetor had imperium. He dispensed justice, usually for a price, protected Roman business interests, and made sure that the locals, either inside or outside the province, obeyed Rome. A job as proconsul or propraetor soon became regarded as just another perk of high political office. Ruling a province for a year was not just fun and profitable. A lucky pro-magistrate might even get to start a war, add new land to the Roman Empire, and win the glory of a Scipio Africanus. Indeed, Africanus's grandson later earned the name Scipio of Numantia for his outstanding generalship in Spain. Of course, this new system of Roman provincial government offered nothing to the natives of the province. But who cared what they thought anyway, right? In the 2nd century BC, Rome went over to the offensive and began building an empire in the east. The first target was Rome's old enemy, King Philip V of Macedon. When the Second Macedonian War ended in 197 BC, all Greece was under Roman quote-unquote influence, if not under Rome's actual command. At first, Rome had hoped to maintain Greece as a buffer state or protectorate against eastern enemies, such as King Antiochus of Syria. 2 millennia later, the Soviet Union did the same thing by setting up a group of satellite states between themselves and Western Europe, the so-called Iron Curtain. In 196 BC, the conquering Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus nobly announced that he would allow the Greeks their freedom. Of course, this freedom was hardly any better than the freedom enjoyed, quote-unquote, by the countries behind the Iron Curtain. The Greeks' freedom was a name only, because they still had to pay Roman taxes, and they still had to contribute troops to the Roman army during wartime. This was exactly the same raw deal that many of Rome's Italian allies got. It's no wonder that many Greeks chose not to play along with Rome. By 167 BC, Macedon also had joined the list of Eastern Mediterranean powers rumphed by Rome. It seemed to the Romans that even pretended freedom was too good for the Greeks. Between 148 and 146 BC, all Greece was added to Roman Empire for all time. As a warning for those tempted to resist Rome's power, the famous old Greek city of Corinth was razed to the ground. Knocking off Eastern Mediterranean superpowers was in fact helpful to Roman security interests. Not so the destruction of Carthage in the Third Punic War, which lasted from 149 to 146 BC. By 151 BC, Carthage had paid off its debts to Rome and was becoming once more commercially viable. To Carthage's west, the kingdom of Numidia made an alliance with Rome and started raiding Carthaginian territory. When Carthage retaliated against Numidia, this fact gave the war party at Rome, led by a mean old dude named Cato the Elder, an excuse to attack under the Jus Fetialis. But in fact, the Third Punic War was aggressive imperialism, plain and simple. Carthage was no longer a danger to anyone. Rome had no real need to attack. But Cato the Elder relied on his immense personal authority as a leading senator and former censor by ending all of his public statements with the phrase Carthago delenda est, or Carthage must be destroyed. And destroyed it was, by none other than the future Scipio of Numantia. The site of Carthage was supposedly sown with sea salt, and its remaining possessions became the province of Africa. The cruel sack of two great old cities, Carthage and Corinth, marked Rome's control of the Mediterranean world and Rome's determination to hold on to everything it had captured. Yet Rome itself was on the verge of being captured. From Romulus's day on, Romans had always been in contact with Greek civilization, either through the Etruscans or through the Greeks themselves. But the good old Mos Maiorum was about to be challenged by the advanced learning and luxurious lifestyles Romans encountered on the Greek mainland while fighting wars with the ancient Greeks. Suddenly, the ways of the Roman ancestors, the glorious Mos Maiorum, weren't quite as dazzling as they had seemed before. How Rome rose to this challenge is no less impressive than Rome's victories over Carthage and over the Greeks. Segment 8E, Conclusions. 1. The Hannibal Channel. Like many males over the age of 35, I have been known to watch the History Channel for a while. Although this is not necessarily an endorsement of their undoubtedly fine programming, they do have many illustrative shows about a wide range of nations, cultures, and related topics. but they are also, at least at this time, kind of fixated on Adolf Hitler. This reflects the previous generation's tendency to fixate upon the Second World War and on the beginning of the Cold War. This also explains why some of us refer to the History Channel as the quote-unquote Hitler Channel. Talking about my generation, we are more or less historically fixated on the end of the Cold War. Your generation, you dang kids, will have to fixate on the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. My generation is fixated on that too, but we have less time. You will literally have decades. The ancient Romans fixated upon Hannibal's invasion of Italy. The experience of having Hannibal spend more than a decade pillaging Italy filled the Romans with a need to keep their enemies away as far as possible. The result was a period of aggressive imperialism and preemptive strikes, which led to the destruction of Carthage and Corinth in 146 BC. 2. Don't you need somebody to hate? Some nations function best when they're angry. The Roman historian Sallust pointed this out as early as the 1st century BC with his theory of the metus hostilis, or foreign fear. He observed that the metus hostilis, the fear of foreigners, enabled ambitious generals to raise client armies and threaten the state. The justified fear Romans felt at hearing the words Hannibal ad portas was channeled into Cato the Elder's obsessive repetition of the words that Carthage has to be destroyed. Carthago delenda est. Although Carthage was virtually harmless from a military standpoint, a war was provoked and Carthage was duly destroyed in 146 BC. According to Sallust, who had himself once been thrashed in public by the husband of a woman he was horsing around with, the Romans became weak and morally flabby once this metus hostilis, or fear of foreigners, had been eradicated. 3. The great national gut check. Rome had been sorely tested, but had proven worthy. The fact that the Romans had actually outgutted Hannibal after he invaded Italy filled them with confidence that they could handle anything. They never forgot the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, in which Hannibal had destroyed their forces. If anything, they placed the Battle of Cannae on a pedestal and tried to use Hannibal's tactics against their own enemies every chance they got, as did generals for millennia afterward. Rome did not enter either of the Punic Wars in order to become the most important power in the Mediterranean. As far as the Romans could tell, the Punic Wars just happened. Notice, too, that for all the honors Scipio Africanus won, and rightly so, for invading Africa and taking the fight to Carthage, thereby ending the Second Punic War, Fabius Maximus, the delayer, got even more credit for managing to buy Rome time. Scipio had flaunted the mos maiorum because he had been elected consul before he was old enough to run for election. And that was something the mos maiorum just didn't encourage. 4. Proactive wars versus reactive. The Romans considered their fight to conquer the Eastern Mediterranean a proactive version of the just war, thereby fulfilling the requirements of the jus fetialis. Security reasons dictated that the Greek kingdoms and Greek leagues had to be obedient little client states and do the Romans' bidding or get taken over. As it turned out, they had to be taken over. The Greeks apparently could not rule themselves. And if it took the absolute destruction of the Greek city of Corinth in 146 BC to make the Greeks realize this, the Romans did what they had to do. Even though Carthage was not becoming an economic power again, there was no evidence, even though they were becoming an economic power again, there was no evidence that the new Carthaginian state was going to pose any military danger to Rome. Cato the Elder's crusade to destroy Carthage at any cost, Carthago delenda est, was more of a political crusade against the family of Scipio Africanus, which had, you'll recall, taken a moderate stance towards Carthage. Already, Rome's internal struggles were starting to affect its foreign policy.